Welcome to another edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Bubba, we are now over 200 different episodes. If you haven't found them, simply go to wherever you get podcasts and look for Rick and Bubba University. Professor Burgess and Bussy here, handing out degrees in common sense, of course, which has now become a superpower. Bubba, we go north. We go to Canada today, and we'll be chatting with Leighton Grey. Now, speaking of wherever you get podcasts, Gray Matter Podcast is the name of his podcast. He is the host. He is one of the greatest legal minds in all of North America, and he joins us on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Leighton, welcome. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm. Thanks very much. I'm going to try and live up to that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, I tell you.
We've raised the bar real high for you, Leighton, so we're expecting a lot.
Yeah, you have to understand we've made our living off low expectations, so we elevate others and let them drag us along. So, so thank you for being with us. And I wanted to ask you: should I be concerned that there's neighbors on my street and they raise both the American and a Canadian flag? Is that okay? Is there anything I should be concerned about?
Absolutely. That's exactly what they should be doing, and I hope that they are doing, because we need all the help that we can get from our broad-shouldered brothers to the south.
It's watching the state of Canada, and you have been unapologetically pointing to this. It is. It's disturbing. We've actually heard the term, and we didn't come up with it, that you can become so open-minded that your brain falls out. Canada, you're going to take it further today, which is what we really want to unpack. We all see that it's becoming, very woke. It's become politically correct to the point of bizarre. But you're saying it's bigger than that. It feels like a road to communism. So talk a little bit about what is the main topic today.
Yeah, I think what you're describing are some of the symptoms, and I think that many of your viewers and listeners are seeing some of these unfold in the United States as part of the Biden administration's assault upon freedom and liberty and prosperity. But up here in Canada, unfortunately, this agenda is much more advanced. Back in 2013, our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, before he was prime minister, was asked at a fundraiser which country in the world he admired most. And he didn't say the United States, who's our closest trading partner and historical ally, upon whom we rely essentially for all of our defense needs. He didn't say Great Britain, which is, of course, the progenitor of our country. He said China. And when asked why, he said that he admired their basic dictatorship. Well, when he became our leader in 2015, he began a process of putting into effect a series of policies and laws that are essentially straight out of the World Economic Forum, straight out of UN Agenda 2030, and straight out of the World Health Organization, which is, in my respectful view, and this is backed up by some of the top geopolitical analysts in North America, including a man named Brandon Weichert, who you might have had on your show. I had him on my program. He says that those organizations that I named are really just fronts for the CCP, the Communist Party of China. And this has caused Canada to become essentially a CCP client state. And it's this bad. I'll just give you two examples of what's going on right now in our country. Rob Schneider, who you probably know as a SNL mainstay back in the 1990s, he was doing a show recently in a city called Regina, which is, I guess, just north of Fargo, North Dakota. And they stopped his show because he was talking about COVID vaccines and censorship. Imagine that. He's doing a comedy routine about censorship, and they stopped his show. Now, in Parliament in our country, right now, we're going through exposure of scandals. That is foreign interference in our last two elections. That's in 2019 and 2021, but also very deep rot foreign interference in our parliamentary structures. Now, in Canada, our parliament is like your Senate and your Congress. These are our elected representatives. These are the people that they are our democratic representatives. They make the laws that govern our country. And what we're discovering is that a report from the National Security and Intelligence Committee in our country has revealed that some Canadian parliamentarians have been involved in foreign interference. And this includes collaborating with foreign governments, China, and spying on colleagues. And our national government, the Trudeau government, has been criticized for turning a blind eye to this, for not taking the issue seriously, in fact, denying that it is occurring. But just yesterday, our deputy prime minister, who's basically second in command for the country, was chased out of a press conference by questions that she refused to answer over this. And so what we're seeing in Canada right now is we are very deep in the grips of this situation where we are losing sovereignty because of corruption within our government, and this is coming as a result of foreign interference. One further note, just to give you an idea of how serious this is, you might have seen that the head of the United Nations has said that it should be illegal, it should be criminal for people to speak favorably about oil and gas, about fossil fuels and their benefits. And of course, in Canada, we have the fourth largest reserves of oil and gas in the world. We have more oil and gas than the United States even. Well, at the same time, on the same day, our prime minister is saying the exact same thing. He's promoting a new law which would actually make it criminal, make it illegal for people to speak favorably about oil and gas in a country that's most of the time, guys, is really bloody cold, especially in the wintertime.
Yeah. When you hear this, it's like you can't, because we started out, I mean, I'm just speaking for myself, and I said, well, Canada's just going down the road of, California and going down the road of a lot of the Northeast, and it's Portland, it's on steroids, and they're just further along on their wokeness and the liberal. But then when I started reading over some of these articles that you've been covering on your podcast. Chinese spies have been found in Canada. Not they might be here. They were there. And you said, matter of fact, it seems like it was so glaring that Trudeau had to say, yeah, they tried to meddle in it, but they weren't successful. And then the others are saying, no, you're a puppet of theirs, and they're trying to set up, as you said, a communist country in training. And find someone that says that sounds good to me. As a matter of fact, that's what I would prefer. And now you've got a whole different game. It's a little different than we've got liberal politics and we got conservative politics. We're talking about full-blown communism.
Yes. And of course, our prime minister comes by this quite honestly because his father was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He was the
No, wait a minute. We thought he was Castro.
Or Castro.
Wasn't that? Did y'all ever clear that up?
That's a subject of considerable debate in our country, especially on Twitter.
Yes.
But his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the leader of our country for 16 years, from 1968 to 1984. And he was an avowed communist. In fact, it was so bad that during the McCarthy era, which sort of had its shadow era in Canada, he was not permitted to teach in our country. He was a college professor. And between 1952 and 1960, he was banned from teaching in Canada because of his communist leanings. And he became our prime minister in 1968. And he began a process whereby he sought to desecularize Canada. Canada was a very religious country back then, perhaps even more so than the United States, and was very successful in doing so. And of course, as we know, those of us who are Bible-thumping lawyers who study history, we know that wherever atheism takes root, communism is sure to follow, and vice versa. Right. They are bedfellows. And so as we look at the 20th century, during which over 100 million people were senselessly murdered in countries like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Nazi Germany, and of course Castro's Cuba, the common undercurrent is total secularization of the country. You drive God out of the picture. That of course totally objectifies human beings, makes us widgets, makes us expendable, makes us useless eaters, to use the wording of the World Economic Forum, and the term that of course Adolf Hitler used in his famous book Mein Kampf. This is what we have, and where this totalitarianism, where this atheism takes root, we see, these policies like we are seeing from the World Economic Forum, where their main proponents are talking about depopulation of 7/8 of the planet. For those of you keeping score at home, that would be 7 billion people. Wow. 7 billion useless eaters. And of course, how is this reflected in real terms? Well, in Canada, they've made a god of climate hysteria.
Oh, yeah.
And they want to shut down the energy industry, which is, of course, the lifeblood of the Canadian economy. More than anything else, we are an energy producer, not only for Canada, but for the entire world.
Yeah.
Many parts of the world, including the United States, they want our oil, they want our gas. And the people in Canada, many of us think this is a really good idea because it keeps everybody fed. It allows us to maintain and hold personal property. It allows us to own things like guns to protect our property. It allows us to support our families and our schools and our hospitals and things of that nature. But of course, what the Trudeau Liberals are all about, taking their cues from the organizations I've described and really from communist China, is to destroy that energy industry, because if they destroy that lifeblood of Canada, then we will be an impoverished nation, a nation of slaves, as opposed to a nation of workers and producers, which we have been for many generations, just as our friends are in the United States.
We'll come back. We'll continue our conversation concerning China. Leighton Grey is our guest. His podcast, Grey Matter podcast, wherever you get podcasts. We'll come back when the Rick and Bubba University podcast continues. So let's talk a little bit about Blaze Media. You know, we work with Blaze. This podcast, of course, part of the Blaze presence with Rick and Bubba. How about some Blaze merchandise? Have you picked any of this up now? Now more than ever, let everybody know how you feel about the most important topics that are going on in the state of our country as well. Go to shopblazemedia.com. Everything from Blaze Heritage and Blaze Media collections, jackets, T-shirts, hoodies, socks, mugs, candles, flags, a whole lot more. And you're going to love it. But you can go there now, shopblazemedia.com. Some cool stuff available. We'll get you 10% off your entire order using the promo code BLAZE10. Shopblazemedia.com, promo code BLAZE10 for 10% off. Wear it proudly now more than ever. Our guest on Rick and Bubba University, the podcast this week, is Leighton Grey. He is in Canada. He is outspoken, conservative, devout follower of Christ. Makes him very unpopular in modern-day Canada. Let's unpack the situation of the church there. You went down that road. So we have some firsthand experience with this. I remember watching the pandemic, and Trudeau took the pandemic to the place that I think even our leftists wanted to take it, and did to some degree. This is my way to grab more power because I now have fear on my side, and I can literally say, do what we say or everybody's going to die. And then the church in Canada started saying, as we had some churches having to do here, but to there where you are, a much more severe degree, because the government literally shut down the churches and hauled off pastors in cuffs. And watching that was nauseating because, to your point, if you ever want to be a good commie, you've got to remove the church. The church has to either get in line or be shut down because at the root of it all, if we're devout followers of Jesus, what do we ultimately say? We really pledge allegiance to the one and only living God above any human government. Now, we're going to be good citizens unless you come to persecute us and you demand us to do things that God forbids, then we will not adhere to that. So we make trouble in their eyes. And, and then my wife and I had the honor of having some pastors there in Canada in our home when they were here working with, some American churches to support church planting there in Montreal, and talking to these pastors, I could not believe what I was hearing. That they were talking about, you don't understand, for us to get a building, if they find out it's going to be a church, they'll do everything they can where we can't even have it. So there's a true persecution of the Christian church in Canada. This is not hyperbole.
Mm-hmm. No, not at all. And I have a unique perspective on this. You might be aware that I was actually the lawyer who represented the two pastors in my home province of Alberta.
That's right.
James Coates and Timothy Stevens, who were profiled on Tucker Carlson. They were also featured in a really worthwhile documentary film called The Essential Church.
Yeah, I
I'd recommend that your people check that out. I have don't worry, I have a very short cameo in it, but it's a wonderful film, and it tells the story, as you just described, of the church as a bulwark against totalitarian oppression. And there's an old Hebrew proverb that says, "Where God is, men are free, and where God isn't, men are slaves." And of course, we know through the Bible, through the Old Testament and the New Testament, for that matter, and throughout history, that this is universally true. And this is why Christianity is so much under attack, is because you will only see individual freedom. You will only see the exaltation of the family, and you'll only see prosperity for working everyday people in societies where God is at the head of the state. And the reason why nations like the United States and Canada have flourished so much, why we became what was called the first world, is because we did have God at the head of the state. And we were fortunate, for the most part, to have leaders who understood this. And they understood that part of the upholding of the rule of law was to understand that you were a servant leader, that you had a role to play as a servant to the people, and that you are not a God unto yourself. Of course, in totalitarian societies, we know that people like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and others, they saw themselves as gods. And a lot of people don't realize, but if you read the writings of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you realize that in fact the Nazi disease that infected that country was so deep, the rot was so deep into the roots of that country, that Hitler sought to make himself head of the church.
Right.
And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was safe in the bosom of the United States and actually went back to Germany to fight this fight. It ultimately cost him his life. He was murdered in the last month or so of the Second World War. But this is he talked about something called the cost of discipleship,
yeah.
and easy grace. And I find that this concept of easy grace is something that is very much akin to the wokeness,
Yep.
where this virtue signaling, where people want to, they say that they support certain things, but really it's a cheap grace. They don't mean it. They're not willing to do anything. But when you talk about these pastors that you described, really, they understand that there is a cost of discipleship. If you're good, you have to walk out your faith. You have to walk out these freedoms. It's not enough to say that you believe in God. If you believe in God, you have to be willing to go to prison to stand up for your beliefs. If you are a Christian preacher, or if you are a Christian lawyer, for that matter, if you're a Christian doctor, being a Christian is not easy. It's not easy to walk in the footsteps of the greatest person who ever lived. We're walking literally in the footsteps of our living God, the Word made flesh. And of course, we are very poor imitations, but He is our example. And of course, these pastors, God bless them, from Quebec. Quebec is the worst place in all of Canada in this respect. In fact, Quebec is so secular now that some nations in South America and Europe actually send Christian missionaries there.
Yeah.
Because that society has become so secularized. And what you said is quite true. It's very difficult to even see churches in Quebec. That's how bad it is there. It's not quite as bad in the province where I live, which is sort of like the Florida or Texas of Canada. And part of the reason why, quite frankly, is because we have the most Americans in this part of the country. We have a very long history of friendship with the United States, which goes back all the way back to the frontier days of the gold rush and the fur trade, and then more recently a connection to places like in Denver and Texas, and other parts of the U.S. through the oil industry, which is as I mentioned earlier, the lifeblood of my province and indeed the entire country. But there's no question that as Christians, we have to be on the ramparts, and we have to understand who the real enemy is here. It's not China. It's not Trudeau. It's not Biden. It's principalities and powers, the things that St. Paul talks about in the New Testament, in my respectful view.
Leighton, let me ask you this. Why do you think, Canada, America here, we have some of the highest standard of living history has ever recorded. Why do you think we have this desire, or it seems like we always drift toward socialism, communism, and our religion losing its passion? Do those go hand in hand? And why do you think we always float that way, as opposed to going the other way, because we actually have proof that the system works, and you see what it has done for everybody?
Well, I think that this is a very astute observation that you make, and it tends to hold true in many different societies. The reality is most people don't care about things like climate change or ideology until they reach a point where they have a reasonable standard of living. And the reason why capitalism works and why it has worked so well is because it's the only economic system that we've ever found that can actually feed and clothe and take care of people. And of course, it goes hand in hand with liberty. The American experiment is really the greatest expression of this throughout history. But you raise an interesting point, and people like Hayek and other economic theorists above my pay grade have found this connection. Milton Friedman, an American economist you probably know about, has also found this connection between the development of socialist ideas, the sort of liberal ideas, small L liberal ideas, that only blossoms in nations which seem to enjoy a certain degree of standard of living and of freedom and prosperity. And it seems that we forget what brought us those things.
Right.
I was talking about this last night on a live stream show. We were talking about the situation over in Europe. I'm sure you gentlemen are aware of this. We're hearing, although it's difficult to get news, that there's going to be an invasion of Russia, and that there could be 300,000 NATO troops, many of them Americans, on the border of Russia, ready to repel a Russian invasion of Europe, which seems rather unlikely at this stage. But of course, these are the same people who told us in 1939 that Poland invaded Germany on September 1st.
Right. Right.
But we were asking the question, thinking about D-Day, and of course today is the 80th anniversary of that
Sure.
invasion, June 6th, 1944. These young men, many of them teenagers, going over the English Channel on these boats on a cold and windy, breezy day. Anybody who's been to that part of France knows that it isn't Nice.
Right.
And what would have made them get off those boats and storm those beaches, knowing that these band of brothers, many of them would perish. Who would risk their lives today to invade Russia? If we had conscription, if we had a draft in Canada, places like Canada and the United States, who would stand up? Would the trans community do it? Would all of the feminists who have really taken over the military in places like Canada and the United States, would they want to storm those beaches and fight? It's a serious question, because when you talk to those men later on, this greatest generation, the ones, good Canadian, American, and British soldiers who stormed those beaches, almost invariably, the what they mention is, of course, their home and their families and God. Well, how many of these soldiers today would get off those boats and risk their lives for a purpose, a higher purpose, the kind of purpose that sent Dietrich Bonhoeffer back to Germany, knowing that it would likely cause his own death? He horrified his own family going back there. They spent all of their life savings to get him out of Germany to save his life, but he went back there knowing that he would die. Would this prevailing ideology now today that you talk about, would that be something that would cause people to fight for their flag, and whatever flag that is, of course, because some of us think that we're in something called Pride Month,
Right.
Which people like me think is an affront to reason and an assault upon God. But you raise a good point, and it's an open question. But what we're seeing through the rod of socialism is the disintegration of our social structures, of our families, of our communities, of our schools, of our universities. And of course, that has downstream impacts, because then we start to see the type of corruption in government that is so rampant in both Canada and the United States, at least as far as we can tell. In the U.S., if you just take a look at, unfortunately, what's been happening to Mr. Trump in the state of New York, you can see how deep this rod of corruption that goes all the way into our court systems, if you could believe it.
Yeah, I can. Leighton Grey's our guest. We'll continue our conversation when Rick and Bubba University, the podcast, continues right after this. Patriot Mobile, America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. Trust us, there's no others. Dependable nationwide coverage, ability to access all three major networks, which means you get the same coverage you've been accustomed to, but guess what they don't have? Funding the left and these agendas that we're discussing on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast, both in Canada and the United States of America. So when you switch to Patriot Mobile, you're going to send a message that you're for free speech, religious freedom, sanctity of life, Second Amendment. You're going to put those military veterans and military active members in that hero position they should be, first responder heroes, 100% U.S.-based customer service team, making the switch easy. Okay, if you want to keep your same number, fine, same phone, fine. But if you want to upgrade, they can help you, and they'll find the best plan for you. So go now to patriotmobile.com. Make your phone money matter. patriotmobile.com/RickBubba. Put our names together. patriotmobile.com/RickBubba, or call 972-PATRIOT. Make the switch today. Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Leighton Grey is our guest. His podcast, Gray Matter, talking about the seriousness. It's been one of his main topics of what is looking more and more like an attempt for communist China to set up a communist country to our north and our ally, Canada. And you're seeing this happen with things with the government that have been unprecedented. It's almost like we look at what's happening with our country, and if you want to see that on steroids, just look to the north. Yeah. And we've been seeing this firsthand.
Well, we've seen China get very busy in our hemisphere already with the Panama Canal, with the building of structures in the Bahamas. I think they're trying to lure Mexico into a deal now for some construction things. So they're very active. They're not being passive in this at all, are they?
Mm-hmm. No, and Mexico is a great example because, of course, their most recent leader is a woman who's clearly a leftist. She's Jewish, which is interesting, but is very much a leftist, very much in support of many of the values that China is exhorting. But speaking about Canada and comparing that to what's going on in the United States, I would suggest to your viewers and listeners to imagine someone like Ilhan Omar, who is essentially a foreign national. Who is sitting as a member of the House of Representatives in your country.
Yeah.
Imagine if most of your elected representatives running your country were foreign nationals who are actually from countries in Africa or Asia or the Middle East. That is the situation in Canada. Most of the high-ranking positions in our government now are occupied by people who are foreign nationals. And it's been revealed, although they're trying to suppress it, that not only are these people loyal to these foreign countries, but also that they've been spying and taking bribes and revealing information, spying on others and revealing important state secrets. Well, what impact does this have for you people in the United States? Well, Vivek Ramaswamy joked recently, although he was only half joking when he was running for president of your country, at least for the Republican nomination, about the erection of a north wall, a wall that would protect the United States from Canada. Well, that sounds funny, except when you consider that we have the longest unguarded border in the world, the 49th parallel. And that Canada actually borders on 3 oceans, including the whole Arctic sphere of influence, in which the Russians and the Chinese are very active. So we have Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic spheres of influence where Canada could be invaded. And of course, we know that there have been situations in the past, and it's happening right now, where people have infiltrated the United States through Canada. This happened during the 9/11. Some of the terrorists who executed that terrorist strike on the United States actually entered the U.S. through Canada. And so there's a serious question here about whether or not the United States will need to take more of a domestic geopolitical interest in Canada. Because what's happening in Canada is because we're no longer a friendly neighbor to the north as we were perhaps back in the Ronald Reagan, Brian Mulroney days. But now what we have is a prime minister in Canada who is actually cheering. He actually cheered the recent Trump verdict. which most right-thinking people could see was a complete absurdity and a travesty of justice. Well, that's the type of friend that the United States has to the North. And my prediction is that if Mr. Trump is restored to the White House in January, and I pray that he is, because I've read Project 2025 and it's absolutely brilliant. It's the best set of ideas that anyone's come up with politically in a very long time. I think that Mr. Trump is going to take more of a geopolitical interest in the domestic affairs of Canada. I think Mr. Trudeau and his group know this, and that I doubt that a Republican in the U.S. White House is going to put up with the nonsense that's going on in Canada in terms of simply watching us become a CCP client state, because Canada potentially poses the same type of threat to the U.S. that Cuba once did back in the 1960s. And of course, we all know what happened there with the Bay of Pigs, etc. So I see that on the horizon, and I think Trudeau realizes it. In fact, earlier this year, when it became clear that Mr. Trump would be the Republican candidate for the U.S. presidency, Trudeau and his group actually sequestered themselves for 3 days to spitball and talk about what they would do if Mr. Trump became president. So they're hearing his footsteps already. And I think that's all to the good, because here in Canada, those of us who are lovers of freedom and prosperity and frankly of God know that we must have a change in government if the Canadian way of life as we've known it is going to survive.
Let me ask you this question, because Bubba and I have talked about this a lot on the main show. What is the state of Canada as far as the people? Bubba and I have talked about with our country, and what were the numbers, Bubba? We think right now, before anyone's even announced, there's going to be a certain percentage of Americans.
You're going to have in any election here about 48% that's going to vote Democrat, about 45% that's going to vote Republican. They're pretty much locked in. You've got about 5%, 6% in the middle that will make the difference. Now, for the Republican to win, they have to get all of them. For the Democrat to win, they just have to split the middle. And but right now, our polling shows Trump winning these battleground states. So that part is interesting.
I was just going to say, what's the situation before you get that, Bubba? Is Canada similar? I mean, what I'm saying is this is not going to change if you can't get the Canadians to say we must make change. And I know y'all's government is not exactly like ours. You're not a constitutional republic. Your parliament. And you'll have to maybe even educate us on how that works with the people, I assume, through Parliament, your representatives and your senators, even though that's not that's what we would call them. But do you have a desire? You got enough people in Canada that care? I mean, I know in Alberta you might, but you said in Quebec, not so much. I mean, what do you think is y'all's percentage compared to like where we are?
Well, here's the good news. The good news is that Justin Trudeau's government had to cheat with the active interference of the Chinese in order to win our last two national elections. And what's interesting about those last two elections, by the way, is that he had the endorsement of Barack Obama, which arguably is foreign interference in our national elections. Yeah. However, the good news is that Justin Trudeau is the least popular prime minister in Canada in the history of polling. He's even less popular in Canada than Mr. Biden is in your country.
Wow.
And so if there were an election that occurred tomorrow in Canada, there would be the most massive majority ever in favor of the Conservative Party, which is sort of our equivalent of the Republican Party. They have a leader named Pierre Poilievre, who I would describe is sort of like our version of Ron DeSantis. He sort of fits that sort of middle ground, just right of center conservative. And of course, many of the policies of his party are very sensible, and he's been very steadfast, very critical of the prime minister and his government. Unfortunately, what's happened in Canada, what has permitted the Trudeau Liberals to hold on to power is we have a third party called the New Democratic Party. And what I describe is if you imagine if Bernie Sanders had been able to form a third party that was full on socialist. And if they joined forces with the Democrats, which sort of happened in your country, but that third party in Canada holds the balance of power, and they're actually propping up the prime minister. we would be able to rid ourselves of this government were it not for the socialists. And of course, they're even more in the pockets of the Chinese, in my respectful view, than the Trudeau liberals are. The good news is we anticipate having an election by the fall of 2025. I actually think that's going to come much sooner. The pressure that the liberals are under right now, this foreign interference scandal has broken, and I think it's going to be the final straw. I think that we are going to have a national election in this country either later this year or early in 2025. I think the Trudeau government is on its last legs. In fact, I would be surprised if Mr. Trudeau will even last out the summer as the leader of his party. I think he's going to have to step down. Because the heat is really on them right now. And that's saying something, since our media is even more corrupt in this country than yours is in the United States.
That's a lot.
That's saying something. We'll come back. We'll finish our conversation. I know, Bubba, you had one more question you want to ask with Leighton Grey when Rick and Bubba University, the podcast, continues right after this.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
We're back on Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. We got kind of our final segment of this week's podcast with our guest, Leighton Grey.
Like, just two questions. One, one was about your form of government. The party has control, and then the party members will pick who the prime minister is, kind of like England does. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
So how many is there a term limit that he can be the prime minister, or how does that work in Canada?
Sadly, no. He can be the prime minister for as long as he is leader of the party. And what happens in Canada is actually only about 22,000 people in his home riding of Papineau, which is in Montreal, Quebec, elected or voted for Justin Trudeau. Nobody in Alberta votes for him. Nobody in the western part of the province or the western part of the country votes for him at all. But he could get 22,000 votes and actually essentially become what amounts to a dictator of Canada. That is essentially what has happened. The other thing about our system of government is we are a confederation. We are a federation of independent states, much like the United States. So under our Constitution, we actually do not have a national government. We have a federal government, and then we have provincial governments, each of which are sovereign within their own spheres, within their own constitutional powers, much like you have in the United States, where you have state powers and federal powers, and oftentimes they come into conflict, and you have this sort of push and pull between them.
Yes, we do.
This is happening very much so in Canada right now. But what we have with the Trudeau Liberals is a government that much like what's happening with Joe Biden, where he's trying to make the office of president much more powerful than someone like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson would have ever imagined. In fact, the last thing that those gentlemen would have wanted was to provide to the American people just a replacement king.
Right.
Because they saw what happened in Napoleonic or they saw what happened in France. So they would have seen what happened in France, where essentially in 10 years, they went from a king, a monarch, to an emperor with Napoleon. Well, what we have in Canada is the same thing. The office of prime minister is really sort of a figurehead. It is meant to be a figurehead, just much like the presidency. But what's happened in Canada over generations, beginning with Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, is this sort of vacuuming, this sucking up of political power and concentration in this one office, the office of prime minister, to the point where, he's appointing all of our judges, all of our diplomats, all of our Supreme Court justices, even the judges who sit in our provinces, which are, hundreds and thousands of kilometers or miles away from Ottawa. He's appointing all of these people. He's appointing all the people in our Senate. So we have this sort of situs of power, this eye of Sauron, if you will, in our prime minister's office. And it really is a perversion of our constitutional democracy, which is intended to be a representative democracy, just like in the United States, with accountability to the people so that we can replace people over time. But there are no term limits for the office of prime minister. I think that is something that would be a very useful change to our system going forward. and it is something that is being considered in our country.
You mentioned the Plan 2025 being a political package you like. Can you walk that out and explain it a little bit?
Well, I would encourage your viewers to go and take a look at something called Project 2025. If you Google that, and what it is, it's a very ambitious, very complete, very well thought out plan for what is going to happen in the United States if and when Mr. Trump becomes president again. And it isn't Mr. Trump's plan. As I read it, it is the sum of the thought of some of the best and smartest conservative minds in America and perhaps in the entire world. And so what it does is it sets out a plan for how to deal with the sort of Chinese interference that we've been talking about, a plan to deal with things like diversity, inclusion, equity, or DIE, as I call it, in universities and schools and in our corporations. It has a plan to deal with, the deep ideological divisions that exist within our country. It talks about, restoration of the family and the exaltation of the family as the essential constituent unit of democracy and of freedom, which we know it to be. And so it has basically a coherent plan for renovating the American state back to its original form, its intended form, which was limited government with freedom and justice for all, and under a flag, a unified flag, and under a nation that is blessed by God. And so as I read that plan, I think it's not only the best plan for America, I think it's the best plan for the world. I think that plan, as I read it, would solve many of the problems, particularly in the Western world, in the Anglosphere. And I think as I look at countries like Great Britain and others gravitating back towards this, back towards a period of time in our history when we had a better sense of who we are and who God intends us to be in terms of being nations that put God at the head of the state. Because without doing that, in any state, and I challenge you to find one, there is no state where God is not at the head, where you will have the rule of law. The rule of law is a meaningless concept. It's something that leftists simply talk about and they pay lip service to. But really what the leftists mean is they mean rule by law. Mm-hmm. They mean rule by the type of law that was applied in that courtroom in New York when Mr. Trump was convicted.
That's right.
Where you make the law, you pervert the law into something that is a weapon against your political enemies. And of course, the rule of law is the complete opposite of that. It is an expression of God's law. It's an expression of what was set out in the Magna Carta, which says that we're all subject to the law, and that the law should be an expression of the natural law, of God's law, what's in the Ten Commandments, what Moses brought down, and which was designed to set us all free from the bondage of sin. And when I look at what the leftists in America and Canada and elsewhere are trying to bring in and really impose upon us, it really is a tyranny of sin. That's really what it is. When you look at the transgender agenda, when you look at really everything that the CCP and the World Economic Forum and UN Agenda 2030 are trying to impose upon us, it really is the anathema of Western values, of everything that made the West great in countries like Canada and the United States.
Well, there's no doubt about it. Well said. And Leighton, it's just been very enlightening. It sounds like what you said about midway through this podcast. You have to understand what we're really fighting against, and that's supernatural principalities which thrive in chaos and usually are handled when we have order, because that would be placing God back to his proper position, and that is head of the government. And when that happens and we adhere to his standards, we have order. When we don't, we have chaos. And all this just kind of, it's like giving it fuel. So if you want to catch up on what Leighton has talked about in more detail, go to Gray Matter Podcast, wherever you get podcasts. And we thank you for taking time with us today on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Thank you very much.
It's been my great pleasure. God bless.
And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast.